My wife cheated during our anniversary dinner. When I walked into the house, I saw my wife lounging under the table in the kitchen while the turkey was roasting. Let me start the story from the beginning. There's a certain comfort in routines. For years, my life followed a pattern, and in a way, that was the charm of it. I'd wake up early, kiss my wife, Emily, on the forehead before she got up, make a quick breakfast, and head off to the office. I wasn't a high-flying executive or anything, just a steady, hard-working manager at a logistics company. But I was proud of the life I had built for us, content in my own way. Emily and I had met at a concert years ago, a chance encounter that turned into an immediate spark. She was everything I wasn't: vibrant, spontaneous, the kind of person who could captivate a room with her laughter. I was drawn to her like a magnet, and she to me, or so I thought. She had a job in PR, always networking, meeting new people, and climbing the social ladder in a way that made my quieter personality seem almost boring in comparison. But we balanced each other. She would bring me out of my shell. I'd keep her grounded. For nearly a decade, I thought we were solid. Friends envied our relationship, and even strangers noticed the way we seemed inseparable. But over the past few months, a gnawing feeling had crept into my gut, an intuition I tried to shake off as paranoia. Emily started coming home later and later, claiming after-work drinks, client meetings, and impromptu happy hours. Initially, I didn't think much of it. I trusted her. But trust has a funny way of eroding once doubt sneaks in. One Friday evening, Emily came home hours past her usual time, around midnight. She looked surprised to find me still up. I was sitting on the couch, trying to finish a novel I'd been reading, but really, I'd been thinking about her. She looked a little too flushed, her smile too bright, like she was forcing something. She gave me a quick peck on the cheek, muttered something about a work dinner, and went straight to the shower. As the sound of water ran, my gaze fell on her phone, which she had left on the kitchen counter. A notification lit up the screen. "Can't wait for next time, babe." The message was from someone named Alec. I felt my stomach churn, a primal wave of dread. I'd never seen that name pop up on her phone before. I stared at it, my heart hammering as a torrent of questions rushed in. I wasn't proud of what I did next, but I couldn't help it. I unlocked her phone, my hands shaking as I opened the messages. What I found was enough to make my world spin. There were texts, dozens of them, spanning months. Messages detailing meetings, secret rendezvous, and exchanges that were painfully intimate. "Thanks for tonight. I've missed you so much. Can't wait to see you again." Each line was like a punch to the gut. The texts were explicit enough that there was no room for doubt. I put her phone back on the counter, right where she'd left it, and just sat there, numb. The sound of the shower stopped, and I forced myself to compose my face, to look normal, to be the husband she believed was blissfully oblivious. She came into the kitchen, smiling like she'd just come back from a regular night out, completely unaware that her whole facade had crumbled. We made small talk, her asking about my day, telling me a story about someone from her office, but my mind was far away. I could barely respond, my thoughts clouded by questions. How long had this been going on? Why didn't I see it sooner? I wanted to confront her, to shout and demand answers, but I knew that wasn't the way. Not yet. That night, I lay awake beside her, staring at the ceiling as she slept soundly next to me. I felt betrayed, humiliated, and angry all at once. But beneath it all, there was an aching sadness, a realization that the woman I'd loved for so long had been living a lie. The following morning, she acted like nothing was wrong, her cheerful self as she made coffee, chatting about plans for the weekend. But all I could do was nod along, trying to keep my emotions in check. Inside, I was planning my next move. I wasn't about to let her get away with this without consequences. I'd have to gather more information, see how far this had gone. But the shock and anger from what I had seen in those messages, it would take everything I had to keep that hidden. I spent the next few days in a daze, carrying on with my usual routine while the truth gnawed at me from the inside. Emily remained blissfully unaware, still giving me her usual goodbye kisses in the morning, her easy laugh filling our house as she texted, probably to him, under my nose. Each moment with her felt surreal, as though I was watching my life from a distance, observing the slow unraveling of everything I thought was secure. My first step was to gather information. I needed to know exactly how deep her betrayal ran. I started by noting the times she came home late or the weekends when she suddenly had work trips planned. My heart ached with every realization, every lie she'd fed me about urgent meetings and late client calls. I'd swallowed it all without question, trusting her completely. On Tuesday evening, after another suspiciously late night, I decided to take things a step further. When she went to bed, I crept out of the room, grabbing her phone from where it lay charging by the kitchen counter. My hands trembled as I went through her messages with Alec. I discovered more than I could bear. Photos, inside jokes, and exchanges about places I'd never even known she'd been. They'd shared intimate dinners, weekends at hotels, even late-night phone calls I hadn't noticed because I'd been asleep or, worse, out running errands for us. Reading each message, I could see her in a new light. An Emily who was different from the woman I thought I knew. She had an energy in her words, a spark I hadn't seen in her for a long time. I had to admit, I'd ignored those subtle signs, dismissed them as stress or a busy schedule. With each new piece of information, I felt a mix of rage and a painful sort of clarity. I could see how she had distanced herself from me, bit by bit, until we were practically strangers sharing a house. But I couldn't let that end without closure. If she was going to throw away what we'd built, then I needed to understand why. I'd heard stories about other men in my situation, how they'd hire private investigators, gather proof, and take their spouses to court. For a while, I considered it. I even looked up a few investigators, wondering if maybe that was my next move. But something held me back. I wanted to face this situation myself, without a third party between us. I wanted to be the one who discovered her secrets, who brought this ugly truth into the light. A few days later, I followed her. It was a Friday night, and she'd texted me in the afternoon, saying she'd be home late due to a client dinner. I told her to enjoy herself, knowing full well what she was really up to. I tracked down Alec's information from a message he'd sent her with his hotel address, and I found myself parked outside, watching as she entered. My stomach twisted as I watched her disappear into the lobby, her smile brighter than I'd seen in months. I sat in the car for nearly an hour, just staring at the entrance, running over scenarios in my head. A part of me wanted to storm in, to confront them both right then and there. But as tempting as it was, I held back. I wanted to gather every piece of evidence I could, to have her caught with no chance of lying her way out. So I waited until she came out, laughing with Alec, his arms slung around her shoulders like they were the couple. She looked carefree, in a way she hadn't looked around me for years. I took photos of them together, and I stayed hidden, fuming in silence as they said their goodbyes, and she drove back home. That night, as I lay in bed beside her, I felt the sharp pang of resentment rise in me. There she was, wrapped in her secrets, slipping effortlessly into our bed like she'd done nothing wrong. But I'd seen enough to know that this wasn't just some fling. This was a relationship, a betrayal that ran so deep it felt like I'd been living with a stranger all along. The next morning, she was up early, making coffee, humming to herself as she fried eggs. She greeted me with a warm smile, acting as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't keep my anger in check. I felt it seething just under the surface, ready to boil over at the slightest provocation. As I watched her move around the kitchen, I decided I'd had enough. I would confront her soon, but not before I'd made my plans. I'd been giving this too much thought, obsessing over every detail, every way this conversation could go wrong. I wanted her to know exactly what she had done, how deeply she had wounded me, and I wanted her to regret it. But more than that, I wanted her to feel the hurt I'd been carrying in silence. So I set my plan in motion. I'd gather my own proof, confront her, and make sure there was no escaping the truth. But it would have to be done right, without giving her a chance to spin her way out of it. The following days were a whirlwind of preparation. I'd gathered enough proof, photos, messages, timestamps, all the evidence of her lies. Part of me still hoped I'd wake up from this nightmare, that I'd realize it was all a mistake. But I knew the truth. It was time to confront her, to finally force her to look at the wreckage she'd caused. It was a Friday evening, the kind of quiet night we used to reserve for ourselves. Movie marathons, takeout, just us unwinding together after a long week. Emily had texted me earlier that she'd be home late, her client meetings running over again. I knew she'd be with him, as usual. But tonight, I decided, would be different. When she finally walked in, I was sitting in the dimly lit living room, nursing a glass of whiskey. She looked startled to see me awake, her smile faltering as she saw my expression. "Hey," she greeted me, forcing a casual tone, but I could see a hint of something in her eyes. Nervousness, maybe. "Didn't expect you to be up." "Couldn't sleep," I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. She hesitated, glancing toward the bedroom, probably hoping she could avoid whatever was coming next. But I wasn't about to let her escape. "Emily," I started, my tone steady. "I know." She froze, her gaze darting back to me. "Know what?" I let the silence hang between us, watching as the realization dawned in her eyes. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then I remembered the texts, the late nights, the look on her face when she laughed with Alec. All the sympathy evaporated. "Don't pretend, Emily," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I know about Alec. I know about all of it." Her face went pale, her mouth opening and closing as if she were searching for the right words. But there were no words that could fix this. She knew that. Finally, she let out a shaky breath and sat down across from me, her hands twisting together in her lap. "How long?" I asked, my voice breaking. "How long has this been going on?" She looked away, her voice barely audible. "A few months." "A few months?" I repeated, the anger bubbling up inside me again. "You've been lying to me for months? Sneaking around, making a fool out of me while I was here thinking everything was fine?" "It wasn't fine," she snapped, and there it was, the anger, the resentment that had been simmering beneath the surface. "Nothing's been fine for a long time. You just didn't notice." I stared at her, stunned by her audacity. She was trying to turn this on me, to make me the bad guy. "So this is my fault now? You're the one who cheated, Emily. You're the one who lied to me, who betrayed everything we built together." She folded her arms, her expression hardening. "I wasn't happy, okay? I tried to talk to you about it, but you were always so busy, so wrapped up in your own world. I felt invisible." "Invisible?" I repeated, my voice rising. "I was working for us, for this life. I thought we were in this together, Emily. I didn't realize I had to check in every 5 minutes to make sure you weren't." I couldn't even finish the sentence, the disgust too strong. She looked away, her shoulders slumping. "I'm sorry, all right? I didn't mean for it to happen." "Didn't mean for it to happen?" I let out a bitter laugh. "Emily, this wasn't an accident. This wasn't some one-time mistake. This was months of lying, months of planning, of covering your tracks. You knew exactly what you were doing." For a moment, she didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the floor. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost defeated. "I don't know what you want me to say. I messed up. I know that." We sat in silence, the weight of everything we'd shared hanging between us like a ghost. I'd thought this confrontation would make me feel better, that seeing her squirm would somehow ease the pain. But it didn't. If anything, it only made it worse. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I looked at her, taking in the face of the woman I'd loved for so long, the woman who had betrayed me so thoroughly. I wanted to yell, to scream, to throw something, anything, just to release the anger that was clawing at me from the inside. But I knew that wouldn't fix anything. It wouldn't change what she'd done. "We're done, Emily," I said, my voice hollow. "You made your choice when you chose him over us." She looked up, her eyes wide with panic. "Wait, can't we at least try to work through this? I know I made a mistake, but we've been through so much together. Doesn't that count for something?" "It did," I replied, feeling a pang of regret, "until you threw it all away. I can't trust you anymore, Emily. And without trust, there's nothing left." The reality of my words seemed to hit her, her expression crumbling as she finally understood the finality of it all. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. But her apology felt hollow, too little, too late. I stood up, needing to escape the suffocating tension in the room. "I'll stay with a friend tonight," I said, not meeting her gaze. "Tomorrow, you should start packing. We'll figure out the details later." As I walked out the door, I heard her sob, a small, broken sound that echoed in the quiet house. For a moment, I hesitated, almost tempted to turn back. But I knew better. Turning back would only prolong the pain, keep me trapped in the past when I needed to move forward. As I stepped into the cool night air, I felt a strange sense of relief, a weight lifting from my shoulders. The life I'd known was gone, shattered by her betrayal, but in its place was a newfound resolve, a determination to rebuild, to find myself again without her. I walked away from the house, leaving behind the memories, the broken promises, and the life I'd thought would last forever. Walking away from that house, from her, felt like shedding a skin I no longer belonged in. But that initial surge of relief soon gave way to an ache that seeped into every part of me. I found myself at a bar I used to frequent in my 20s, back when life was simpler, my biggest concern being whether I'd have enough saved for rent. I nursed a drink, replaying the argument over and over, her words ringing hollow in my head. I wasn't happy. I felt invisible. How had we come to this? In my mind, I'd built a vision of our life, that had somehow blinded me to the cracks forming right beneath my feet. But regardless of her reasons, her justifications, she'd made a choice. She'd lied, betrayed, and left me to pick up the pieces of the life I thought we were building together. After finishing my drink, I headed to my friend Nate's place. He opened the door, his face shifting from surprise to concern the moment he saw me. We hadn't talked in a while. Life had drifted us apart in that unintentional way that marriage, work, and adulthood often do to friends. Still, he was one of those rare people you could always count on, no matter the years or distance between you. "Jake," he said, putting a hand on my shoulder. "What's going on, man?" I didn't even know where to start. "I don't know, Nate," I managed, my voice barely steady. I think my marriage is over." He didn't ask questions, just pulled me in for a quick, silent hug, and that simple gesture, one I hadn't realized I needed, nearly broke me. For the first time since discovering her betrayal, I felt like I could breathe again. Nate offered me a beer, and as we sat on his porch overlooking the quiet street, I told him everything. How I'd found out, how I'd confronted her, how her excuses had only deepened the betrayal. He listened without interrupting, just let me pour out every thought, every ounce of hurt, until I was drained. "You know," he said quietly when I finished, "it's going to be a long road, but you'll get through this." I nodded, hoping he was right, but deep down, I was terrified of the road ahead. The idea of moving forward, of piecing together a life without her, felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, staring into the unknown. The next few days were a blur of logistics, paperwork, and painful conversations. I returned home to find Emily had already started packing her things, the room stripped of the personal touches that had once made them ours. Every space felt hollow, like a house in the process of being abandoned. We exchanged only a few words, keeping things as civil as we could manage. One evening, while boxing up some of her books, I came across an old photo album we'd made during our honeymoon. We'd spent weeks traveling through coastal towns, laughing over broken translations, taking silly photos in front of every landmark. I remember thinking, back then, that I was the luckiest man alive. Looking at those photos now, I barely recognized the people we used to be. I closed the album and slid it back onto the shelf. It was too late for nostalgia. Emily moved out within a week, leaving behind a silence that was both a blessing and a curse. I found myself haunted by her absence, by the memories of our life together, while at the same time feeling a strange sense of freedom, as if I could finally let go of the weight I'd been carrying for so long. In an odd way, her betrayal had set me free, forced me to confront the reality of our marriage, to see it for what it truly was. One evening, Nate came by with takeout and a six-pack, insisting on keeping me company. He didn't bring up Emily or the divorce, and I was grateful for it. Instead, we talked about everything else: work, old college stories, random memories I hadn't thought about in years. It was the first time in weeks that I'd felt even a sliver of normalcy. You know, Nate said after a while, there's a whole world out there beyond all this. Maybe it's time you started looking forward instead of back. I nodded, knowing he was right, but unsure how to even begin moving forward. The life I'd known, the person I'd thought I was, had been tied up with Emily for so long that I wasn't sure who I was without her. But as I looked around the half-empty house, at the remnants of a life I was slowly dismantling, I realized that I had a choice. I could stay stuck in this pain, wallowing in what could have been, or I could take a step, just one small step, towards something new. That night, after Nate left, I opened my laptop and started searching for activities, new hobbies, things I'd always wanted to try but had put off. I signed up for a local hiking group and enrolled in a photography class I'd been curious about for years. They were small steps, but they were mine, and for the first time, I felt a faint glimmer of excitement for the future. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into those new pursuits, discovering parts of myself I'd forgotten existed. The hiking group introduced me to people from all walks of life, each with their own stories, their own scars. Being in nature, away from the city, gave me a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. And the photography class, well, it was harder than I'd expected, but there was a certain satisfaction in learning something new, in capturing the world through a different lens. One evening, after a long hike, I found myself at the top of a cliff overlooking the ocean, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon. There was a quiet beauty in that moment, a reminder that life, despite its heartbreaks, still had so much to offer. As I stood there, breathing in the salt air, I felt something inside me shift, a sense of acceptance settling over me. The pain of Emily's betrayal would always be a part of my story, a scar I would carry with me, but it no longer defined me. I was more than the hurt, more than the broken pieces she'd left behind. I was someone who had loved deeply, someone who had given his all, and while it hadn't ended the way I'd hoped, it had led me here, to this moment of quiet strength. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself healing, bit by bit, rebuilding a life that was mine alone. There were still difficult days, memories that would surface without warning, but they no longer held the same power over me. I'd learned to let go, to release the bitterness and focus on the possibilities ahead. And slowly, almost without realizing it, I began to feel whole again. Months had passed since I'd closed the chapter on Emily, and I found myself adjusting to a life that felt unfamiliar yet full of potential. I'd stopped wearing my wedding ring, stopped glancing at my phone expecting to see her messages. The house was fully mine now, with every trace of her either packed away or donated. The silence that had once felt oppressive now felt peaceful, a blank canvas waiting to be filled. I still kept in touch with a few old friends, but I was meeting new people too. The hiking group introduced me to people who saw me as Jake, just Jake, not Jake and Emily. I began to open up more, sharing stories about myself that had nothing to do with my past life, relishing the feeling of rediscovering who I was. The photography class, in particular, was a source of unexpected joy. I'd signed up on a whim, expecting it to be a temporary distraction, but it quickly became a passion. I started bringing my camera everywhere, capturing moments I might have once overlooked. An old couple holding hands, a kid laughing as he chased his dog, the way light filtered through the trees during a hike. Each photo felt like a new layer of myself, something I hadn't known existed, slowly being revealed. One day after class, I struck up a conversation with Sarah, another regular in the group. She was an architect, with an eye for detail that I envied. We'd met casually a few times, but our conversations grew longer each week, evolving from small talk into something more genuine. She was kind, patient, with a smile that made it easy to open up. There was no rush to it, no expectation. Just two people getting to know each other, sharing moments of laughter and quiet understanding. One Saturday, she invited me to a small art gallery showing downtown. It wasn't the sort of place I'd usually find myself, but with Sarah, everything felt easy. We spent hours wandering the exhibit, admiring works that ranged from abstract paintings to sculptures and installations. I'd never felt at home in an art gallery, but something about the experience, with her by my side, felt right. As we walked out into the cool evening air, Sarah stopped in front of a mural painted on the side of the building. The colors were vivid, almost surreal, a burst of reds, blues, and greens that seemed to come alive in the fading light. She turned to me, her face lit by the street lamp, her eyes filled with curiosity. "Do you ever feel like life just restarts itself?" she asked softly, almost to herself. "Like, sometimes you think you're stuck on one path, and then something happens, and suddenly you're somewhere new?" I smiled, realizing how perfectly her words echoed my own journey. "Yeah," I said, my voice quiet. "It's strange, but I think I know exactly what you mean." She nodded, and we stood there for a moment, both lost in thought. I wanted to tell her everything, the pain, the betrayal, the sense of rebuilding myself from the ground up. But there was time for that, and somehow, I knew she would understand it all in her own way. As the weeks passed, my connection with Sarah deepened. We shared more hikes, evenings at art shows, even quiet mornings over coffee at her place. I found myself laughing more freely, something I hadn't done in a long time. There was no rush, no pressure, just a quiet companionship that felt like a balm for my still healing heart. One evening, as we sat on her porch overlooking the city, she leaned her head on my shoulder. The sky was painted in deep hues of purple and orange, the air filled with the scent of blooming flowers from her garden. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a sense of calm, a peace I hadn't thought possible after Emily. "You know," Sarah began, her voice soft, "sometimes it feels like the hardest things we go through are just chapters in a story that's still being written. Maybe we don't get to decide what happens to us, but we do get to decide what comes next." Her words struck something deep inside me, and I realized she was right. Emily's betrayal had been a chapter, one that had hurt more than I could ever explain. But it wasn't the end. I had a say in what came next, in the life I wanted to build moving forward. As I held Sarah close, I knew I wasn't fully healed yet. Some wounds would always leave scars. But I was no longer afraid of the future. I no longer defined myself by what had happened to me. There was love in the world still, and beauty in every moment if I was willing to see it. In the months that followed, I continued building that life, one small step at a time. I spent weekends hiking, photography outings filling my phone with images that captured this new chapter, these new memories. Sarah became a steady presence, a friend, and maybe something more, though we both allowed ourselves the grace of taking things slowly. One morning, while on a quiet hike, we stopped at a cliff overlooking a valley. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting golden light over everything. I pulled out my camera, capturing the scene, and then turned it towards Sarah, who laughed, playfully covering her face. "Come on, Jake," she teased. "You're not going to take a photo of me, are you?" "Just one," I said, snapping the shot as she lowered her hands, her face bright with laughter, her eyes filled with warmth. As I looked through the lens, I realized something profound. I was happy. Genuinely, truly happy. And for the first time, I wasn't looking back. I was here, in this moment, fully present, ready for whatever life had in store. Life had taken me down a road I hadn't planned, a path filled with heartbreak and lessons I hadn't wanted to learn. But in the end, it had brought me here, to a place of peace, acceptance, and the promise of something new. It was a beginning I hadn't anticipated, but one I was ready to embrace with open arms. And as the sun rose over the valley, I took Sarah's hand, grateful for every twist, every turn that had led me here, to a life rebuilt, a heart mended, and a future filled with hope.